Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. This is Shauna. I'm the host of Real Talk by SLG Impact. And today I'm joined by Jake Hirshman. Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Shauna. Excited. We had you on the podcast on Life in the Front Office, so excited to be on Real Talk here.
Yeah, absolutely. That was so fun to be on with you. It was such a good chat, as we were
You
just
get to you
saying.
get to flip the script. It's kind of cool. Like I get to actually answer questions now.
I know you probably don't get this opportunity too often. Well, actually, probably you do with all the stuff you do.
It becomes more of a conversation, right? So I'm excited for this chat, and certainly I know you'll have a good couple questions up your sleeve.
Yeah, absolutely. So today's actually a pretty big day for you. I'll get to the introduction in a minute, but I have to go right to it's a big day. You're launching you're just for pre-order,
Yeah.
just released your second book, right? That you authored with Andy Dolich.
You got it. Yeah. So LOL, as many of you might think, laugh out loud, and you're like, what the heck? They wrote a book about laughing out loud. No, we've got a different LOL. It's called Loss of Logo. And so the title is LOL Loss of Logo. What's your next move? And really the essence of the book is to remove the logo from the business card and try and understand what makes you tick, what makes you successful, what your priorities are, and ultimately what your own logo is, aside from wherever you decide to take your career. We all know that your careers can go in zigzags and different paths, and
Sure
there's plenty
can.
of logos to be had. But at the end of the day, whenever your career is done, right, you have one logo, and that's
Yeah.
yours. So, kind of lifting up, the hood per se as to what's all behind that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think there's been so much attention focused on people building their personal brands. I think it's a great time, that this comes to the forefront. And it's really is something that you're focusing on the sports industry. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, though, it's all business and it's all
Yeah.
industries. Like sports as a whole, the sports and entertainment industry is a very small microcosm in the world that we live in,
Hmm.
right? We all think it's big and we live
It's
in
really
it,
not.
but it's really not. Like you look at the industry as a whole, and the amount of revenue that flows through it is minimal compared to massive companies, in the S&P 500 and all that sort of stuff. Like, but at the end of the day, we as the sports and entertainment industry get a lot of the attention, right? A
Yeah.
lot of the um, the income that others are spending, right, outside of work. And for what are they going to do for fun? They're going to go to a game, right? And hopefully all that's starting to come back here soon. But I think when you think about who you are as a person, like
Mhm.
a lot of people attach themselves to where they work, whether they work at JP Morgan Chase or they work at, a restaurant or they work at a sports entity, right? I think it's attaching that logo in which, look, the brand is important. People build and make a lot of money off of a brand, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's what attracts, certain fans or consumers. But for the individual that works for it, it's how do you do your best work and fulfill yourself and make sure that you can provide for the job that you're doing, but also detach yourself, right?
Yeah.
Because there is life outside of work in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there is if you make time for it, right? So I
That's
think that
true.
the conscious notion of it definitely helps. And I think it's interesting though, is if we step back to your own history. So you played baseball in college, right? You coached at college level. You're a professor, an adjunct professor. You also have your podcast that you mentioned earlier, and you work for the PGA Tour. So I'm kind of curious in your own trajectory, like, did you experience that logo, that sort of I call it identity crisis or something when you step away from a logo or you step away from an identity and you're starting
Mhm.
to figure out what your own brand is. So I'm curious, what was your journey in that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So, like, I've zigzagged as I mentioned, a lot of people's careers do, and I've already zigzagged early. And
Yeah.
I'm wearing my Redlands polo today because that's where really it all started.
Okay.
High school's high school for everybody, right? But
Yeah.
like once you get into college and you got that experience, and then those who go on, whether it's be grad school or kind of their next career move, it all started there. And then, for me, going to the University of Redlands was how can I make the most of that experience, not only on the field from a baseball perspective, but in the classroom to
Hmm.
get a business degree that ultimately was going to point me in a direction that I didn't know where it was going to take me. Right. And then I went to the Ohio University Sports Administration program, got my 2 graduate degrees there, tried to finish up playing, lost that logo as soon as I hung up the cleats, right?
Yeah.
Kind of everyone gets cut at some point, everyone ends their career. I coached and helped out a little bit on the staff before leaving grad school to go work for the Mariners. And that was where my big loss of logo came. I worked,
Mm.
kind of all my undergrad and graduate school career and going from the playing to the coaching and kind of being involved in baseball. That was my identity as a whole, right? It was, hey, I know Jake, he's the baseball guy, right?
Yeah.
And it was, how do you get away from that? How do you explore other parts of who I am?
Yep.
And when I went into the player development side of the game, which is very, very hard to get into, that was like the dream came true, right? It was getting into the front office. And for me, I had, an interesting start where 3 months in, I was told that my services were no longer needed. And I packed up the apartment, across the street, and was in my house that I grew up in at 8 a.m. that morning after a 6 a.m. call. And it
Wow.
was, for me, it was like one of those, well, what do I do now? Right.
Yeah.
Like you just finished up grad school. Like, everyone kind of has their first entree into the industry. You have this direction of a career path in which you think you want to go down. And then all of a sudden that's no longer the path. Right. And you kind of have to sit there and think, and you go, okay, well, what do I really want to do? Who do I
Hmm.
call? Who can help me? Right. And fortunately, I've had a lot of people, including Andy, who was one of my first calls, who helped me get to where I am now. Right. And
Yeah.
everyone, the quote that he used to me was, well, everyone gets fired once, uh, at least once, I should say. And, you know, it may just happen either earlier or later for some in their career,
Yeah.
right? And so at whatever point that happens, it's how do you deal with it? And so
Yeah.
that loss of logo component to me was a little bit of the inspiration behind the book. Andy will tell stories about how he's gotten fired, but at much higher levels per se, um, with a little bit more complex. But
Yeah.
I think when you step back, as you were saying, from all of that, you kind of take that deep breath and you're like, all right, what's my next move? Right. And that's
Yeah.
kind of the essence behind the book is what's my next move and how am I going to get there? And then you kind of just figure it out along the way. I think one of the best questions that anyone will ask in an interview is like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? The honest answer you have to give is, I don't know.
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
and you go back to the I'd say, Shauna, you don't even know where you're going to be in 5 years, right? Like no
I
one
told people
does.
I'm just trying to get through the days. I'm just trying to
Right.
survive and not get COVID.
Exactly. And so I think it's trying to look, I've tried to really focus on the present a lot, and like,
Yeah.
what can I accomplish today? What can how can I help others? Right. Like it's that
Mm.
giving back component. Like if there's someone who reaches out, because that's what others did for me, right? To get to where
Yeah.
I am now. And you kind of just continue that cycle knowing that good things will come.
Yeah, absolutely. Two things I'll tell you is that one, and I was looking back at your LinkedIn profile, I love that it stood out that you're looking to make a positive impact or just an impact. And so I was like, I knew I liked this guy. And then, you mentioned the
All
thing
about
about,
impact.
I'm sorry.
It's all about impact,
It
right?
is really, I know. Um, and then the other thing is you just said a minute ago about being present. And I have to tell you, like from the first time you and I spoke, that was one of the things that I really noticed. You were completely present for our conversation. And it really stood out to me. I think especially with so many people are so distracted, so distracted. And so I think those are great, qualities that you bring, to the table and everything. So I think it's awesome what you're doing.
Well, Shauna, you asked where it all started. I had a freshman class that I took at the University of Redlands that was focused on speech.
Ah,
And the professor there, he was like one of the first people to grade the presidential debates back in 76 with Kennedy. So like, I mean, he was a stud in himself, but one of the things that he taught us and one of the presentations that he had in the first class was kind of the statistics behind listening, right? And like, how much do you actually, if you really focus and you try and listen to someone, how much you actually going to retain? And I forget the percentages, but it's like 35% you retain, 15% you actually like learn something, and then 7% you can actually put into action. Like it's very small amounts
Yeah.
of what we just have had the conversation for the last 10 minutes. Like how much have you actually retained and the listener retained and so on? What are you going to take from it? So with a lot of the podcasts, like it's really being intentful and having intentful listening, right?
Yeah.
To where you're really trying to understand their perspectives, where they're coming from, what are they trying to say, as opposed to thinking about what you're going to say next, right? And what question are you going to ask
That's
next?
not just podcast, that is general conversation where half the time
Absolutely.
you're like, wait, stop thinking of how you're going to answer me. Come back here, listen. So,
Absolutely. It's applicable to all things,
yeah.
dating across the board, right? Like it's applicable to everything.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. I want to go back to something that came to mind when you were talking about loss of logo and you were talking about that it comes in different phases. And I'm curious your perspective of if you have that experience where you're like, okay, I've now identified with, like I used to literally say to people, hi, I'm Shauna and I work for the NBA. Hi, I'm Shauna and I work for Nike. And I in retrospect, I was able to look back and see that I did that. But I'm curious your thoughts on what is the thing that helps break that type of cycle so that, and is it in being able to consciously intentionally create your brand? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that word intention is what you use. Like it's an intent. What's your
Yeah.
intent of introducing yourself as, hi, I'm Shauna, I work at the NBA? What's your intent of that message? Is it for them to go, oh, wow, she works at the NBA. That's really cool. Like, no, your intent of the introduction is, hi, I'm Shauna.
Right.
Nice to meet you. Right. And you
Yeah.
want to know the same about that person that's on the other end. And certainly that might get brought up in conversation. I'm sure it will, but it's
Right.
not the first thing you lead with. And that's not your
Hmm.
intent.
Yeah.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
that makes a lot of sense. I think it is then it's that it's awareness, it's intention. And I think sometimes that comes with experience. It was something that I realized over time, where again, I had to consciously think, okay, I don't want to repeat that behavior because what it ends up can leave you in that loss, right? And I think that's probably what you go into to some degree, it's like what happens when you lose that logo, lose that identity. It's just great to hear your perspective on that. And I think again, those takeaways about intention is really helpful.
Well, and look, I'm very fortunate to be where I am today, the things that I've been able to do up to this point as well. But as you know, like whether it's, you know, uh, relationships that take you to different places, like people leave and move jobs all the time, right?
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of life. But if you are
Mhm.
so attached to what you're doing and that's what your identity is, to move to a different city, to move jobs, to move industries, to change bosses, change coworkers, like all of that stuff is a really hard transition as itself. Why make it harder on yourself to also have to try and recreate your identity, right?
Yeah.
If you have your identity and who you are, and then you're just happening to move into the other areas, it makes that transition a little bit easier. Not to say that it's easy at all, because it's hard across all levels, but how do you make it easier for yourself?
Yeah. It's such great perspective. And I think this is the kind of stuff that I think about sometimes. And I think if I only knew it before, if I only knew then what I know now. So I think it's just awesome that you're making this available to people and truly having the impact on their lives and people's journeys. So again, it was pre-orders available starting today, and then it's available everywhere May 4th. Is that
Yep,
correct?
May 4th on Amazon. And so it's an ebook that'll go to either Kindle or iBooks. Kind of same thing with the podcast, right? Like wherever you listen to your podcast, wherever you get your ebooks. And, Andy was asking me, he's like, how do we sign the ebook? Like, that's a good question.
That is a good question. Stumper.
So, we can do an email signature, something of that sort. I think,
Okay.
but yes, I'll provide some information for you to share with your listeners on where you can go.
Okay, that's fantastic. And that you also have another book coming out this summer, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's been out, but
Yeah.
we're launching the second edition. So 20 Secrets to Success for NCAA Student Athletes.
Ah,
Shortened up the title a little bit for the
okay.
second version, and we added a chapter on NIL, which is
Oh,
obviously a
nice.
big issue, for NCAA student athletes, the colleges, athletic departments, etc. And look, the idea behind that book, and it kind of is similar in a sense to LOL, is that this one was all about kind of how do you succeed as a student athlete, and then how do you
Mhm.
transition out of sport and into life.
Mm.
It's the same type of transition. You're
Yeah,
losing your logo as an athlete and you're going into the real world. What do you do
exactly.
now? And it's
Mhm.
and it's not only just a student athlete, it's any athlete, right? Whether you're high school, college, or pro, and you're
Yeah.
you're losing that identity component of who you are. So it doesn't necessarily have to be what's the logo on your business card, but when you're an athlete, you have a jersey and you have a logo, right? I've got
Yeah.
I've got my logo on my polo that we'd wear to travel, right? Like, it's the
Yeah.
same thing. And so yes, that will be coming out here later July, early August, kind of as our second edition, rolling it back out. And um, it's one of those things that we created from the start. It was very evergreen content because we
Okay.
knew that, hey, 3 years from when it was released in January of 2018, it was still going to be prominent in today's society. We were kind of, when we started talking to athletic departments, they're like, yeah, you're kind of early for us. Like, we're not there yet. We don't
Yeah.
want to talk, we don't want to touch on this topic yet.
Yeah.
And now obviously it's been at the very forefront of a lot of things. And so
Yeah.
look, great to see the progress as a whole. And our goal is that if one person, and this with either of the books, right, like if one person reads it and they find a perspective that helps them, like, that's the impact at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned impact earlier, like that's the goal, right, is
Yeah.
impact someone somehow, some way.
Absolutely. Or what the heck are we doing here, right?
Right.
I know.
I
No,
mean,
it's true. It's that's exactly how I've always felt. And and I think just the last thing here is just to say, like, I really like genuinely appreciate you bringing these things forth and having conversation that maybe people don't feel they're ready for, or and I think that there's such a parallel between athletics and the boardroom business. And I think there's so much that we can take from it and apply to our daily lives, to our work lives. And so it's, high time that people are really talking about it, because this is the stuff that we need to know. Like I said, if I only knew then what I know now, I think I probably would have saved myself some pain along the way. So
well, and back to that listening point, like, to understand what other people go through, right?
yeah.
That was part of what we did with this book, is we included 38 other professional perspectives.
Oh,
So we got answers and different perspectives and insights from individuals across the industry,
oh,
because
awesome.
Andy and I only have two perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Like, now we have 40 in the book, and we're going to
Amazing.
do a second version at some point, where if you send us your LOL story, we'll put it in the next one, right? Like, I think it's one of those things that if you really listen to people, you realize how much you still have to learn, right?
Yeah.
And so, to that point, right, like, you wish you knew then. Well, yeah, so do I. But I also know that there's so much more that I'll learn in the next 10 years that I wish I knew now, right? And
Yeah.
so how do you not necessarily get ahead of that, because it's not possible sometimes, but
Right.
how do you have the right approach and perspective to it, I think, is crucial. And talking about the different topics, like, these are not, like, the identity topic is not something that people like to talk about all the time. It brings up different emotions for certain people than others. And um, some people have never had to think about why they work in sports. They just want to, right? And
Yeah.
that's, like, those types of things. The Mariner story that I told at the beginning of this, like, it's in the book. I've never really, like, this is the first time you're hearing that. Like, I don't really talk about it because it's
Yeah.
not something that was, like, for me, it was a huge hurdle I had to overcome. And it's part of the
Yeah.
adversity that I've, had. But my adversity is much different than your adversity, which is different from someone else's adversity, right? So you don't want to um, make it seem like yours is worse than others, because
Yeah.
it's not. It's just different.
Yeah, it's just all different perspectives that we can learn from each other. And I often say, like, there's a lot of us that suffer pretty similarly. And so the more we can share and we help people along the way. And this is real talk for a reason, it's to be able to have conversation that doesn't necessarily always feel that comfortable or, be open about things. So thank you so much for coming here today and sharing everything. And congratulations on your book and early congratulations on the relaunch of the one this summer.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate you having me on Real Talk, and certainly, happy to share, Life on the Front Office podcast as well. We'll be sharing some more about the book. There's some upcoming episodes with Andy and I that are talking a little bit more about it in
Oh,
depth.
nice.
So take a listen, and if there's anything I can do to help anyone who's listening to this, please reach out on LinkedIn, and happy to certainly respond and chat.
Okay, awesome. We'll include those links in the when we post this later this
Awesome.
week. All right,
Thanks.
thanks so much, Jake. Bye.
Appreciate it.